Okay, so another warm welcome to everybody who is in the room and who is joining us today for our webinar for one of our series during Neurodiversity Week. So today our topic is going to be on neurodivergence and menopause. This topic is often overlooked, but it can be a major life transition. But for neurodivergent individuals, particularly autistic individuals and those with ADHD, it can bring unique and significant differences. Research increasingly shows that menopause is not just a hormonal shift, but it is a neurological transition profoundly affecting the brain. So today we're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Rachel Moseley here with us today. Dr. Moseley will probably do her own introduction, but I'll just do a wee one to start off today's session. Rachel is an autistic academic at Bournemouth University, whose research has explored the mental health and well-being in autistic adults. So today, Rachel will be sharing insights from her work on how menopause impacts neurodivergent individuals and discussing ways to offer better support, especially in the workplace. So before we dive in, just a few housekeeping points. Today's session will end at 11 a.m. Rachel will present for around 45-50 minutes and followed by a Q&A session. You're welcome to use the chat function throughout today, and if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, please use the Q&A function. You should see that up at the top there. The session is being recorded, as I've mentioned, but the Q&A will not be included in the recording. So we do encourage you to keep your cameras off for privacy. During today's session, please ensure your mic is muted unless you're talking. It just allows us not to have any background noise. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat this morning, so feel free to drop any questions and I'll bring them up at the end when Rachel is ready. So with that being said, I'll just give a hand over to Rachel in one moment. As you can see on the screen here, this just gives you a bit of an overview about our charity. So for those who are not familiar with us, our charity is Service and Mindroom Centre, more formally known as Mindroom these days. We've been around for 25 years this year, so it was founded in 2000, really much with the focus of raising awareness around neurodevelopmental conditions. So you'll see the photograph here shows Sophie with her daughter Annie. So Sophie and Robin Dell was the ones who founded Mindroom. And it was very much in the notion to ensure that there is a lot more information and support available to other parent carers and young people who are potentially going through neurodivergence and wanting to find out a little bit more information around that. So today we deliver a range of services and activities and support neurodivergent individuals, their families and professionals. I'm not going to go into detail just now, but I am going to share the contact details in the chat so you can find out a bit more about how to access our support. With that, I'm now going to pass over to Dr. Rachel Moseley. So Rachel, over to you, and thank you very much for joining today's session.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And this is just to say, just so everyone knows, that you will receive these slides later on. So please don't worry about scribbling things down. That's the wonderful thing about recording and having the slides. So I don't think I will do an introduction because I had such a wonderful introduction. Thank you. But I'm so pleased to be here with you all this morning. And talking about our work on neurodivergence and menopause. So we've primarily focused on autism, but I'm going to talk about autism and ADHD under that umbrella of neurodivergence. So I want to start with a few words about menopause because you guys might be very familiar with neurodivergence, but I think many people feel like they don't know very much about menopause. We don't learn about it in school. There's a bit of a taboo around it, so a lot of us feel unprepared. So I want to talk about why it's significant and why we need to think about it in the context of neurodivergence. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why neurodivergent people might have a difficult time. Not all do, but some do. And I want to finish with a few words around how we can best support people, particularly in the workplace. So, sometimes when I talk about neurodivergence and menopause, people think, well, why do those two things go together particularly? Why do we need to think about menopause in a neurodivergent context? I would want to argue that this is a big deal and we need to think about it. And I want to just spend a few minutes explaining why. So, what is menopause? Basically, it is the transition from a reproductive to a post-reproductive state. It will affect all people assigned female at birth, whether or not you identify as female. And it's principally driven by declining estrogen. You can see in this figure here that estrogen changes throughout the lifespan. But what you see at menopause and the stage of menopause called perimenopause is you see a decline in estrogen. It's a gradual decline, but it's not a smooth one. You can see it's quite jagged there. And so that stage of time when the person starts having menopausal symptoms is called perimenopause. Basically, it's a stage when you're having symptoms, your estrogen is declining, but it's really jagged. So it means that you're still having periods. They might be a lot less frequent or more irregular, but you are still having them. It's only when a person has had 12 consecutive months without a period that we say they have reached or passed menopause, and at that point they are postmenopausal. So the menopausal transition encompasses this whole time, the perimenopause and that postmenopause state. So it usually starts when a person is in their 40s and it lasts maybe 4 to 5 years on average, this whole transition. But 1 in 10 people will actually experience symptoms for up to 12 years. And the range of symptoms is really diverse. So the one that people tend to know about is hot flushes or hot flashes, and the nighttime equivalent, which are night sweats. But there's also psychological changes in your memory, your concentration span, changes in your libido or sex drive, changes in your sleeping patterns, changes in your mood. There's also bodily changes, like people find that their metabolism changes, the way they take on weight and lose weight changes, their joints might be sore. So there's a whole range of symptoms, and these symptoms occur during perimenopause, but they also continue into the postmenopausal stage. On average, they stop maybe 4 years after your last period. So this means that you can be symptomatic with menopausal symptoms for a really significant chunk of your life. And the range of these symptoms tells us something really important, linking back to what Nellie said. The majority of these symptoms are actually neurological. They're not based in the ovaries. They have a basis in the brain and its interactions with the body. So, as Nellie said, menopause is actually just one of several neurological transition states in the lifespan development. So these are necessary, natural times, but basically during them, the brain undergoes really significant structural and functional reorganization. So the brain really differs in its structure and its function, and this results in changes in your body, changes in your reproductive capability, and also changes in your experience of the world, in your emotional and your social development. And these are also times of significant social change if you think about the kinds of things that happen in your life around these times. So puberty, growing up, you're probably starting a new school, you're beginning to have romantic relationships. Pregnancy, your whole way of relating to other people is going to change quite dramatically. You're becoming a parent. The direction of support is changing, where you now have to support someone else rather than being supported by your parent. changes with your relationship with your partner. And perimenopause and menopause more broadly is likewise a time of a lot of social change. So your relationship with your parents. Previously, they've supported you, but now they're aging. They are perhaps becoming ill. You might be losing them. You've still got your own children, possibly, who are growing up, and so you're supporting them as they age, especially if they're neurodivergent, which they are more likely to be if you're neurodivergent. So you're supporting them, and you're also supporting your parents on the other side. So you're called the sandwich generation. You might also have changes in your relationships. You might have changes in your work role and your work structure. So there's a lot going on. And we know that these neurological transition points, which are really kind of lifespan transitions with a lot going on, we know that these are times where neurodivergence can really come to light, where people can struggle and hence they receive a diagnosis. But if we think on an epidemiological level, basically that means the study of health and well-being across the lifespan. If we look across someone's whole life, what we see is peaks in physical and mental illness around these 3 points that we call the 3 Ps. Basically, during these neurological transitions, people assigned female at birth are more sensitive to physical and mental illness. We're more vulnerable to it. We're also more sensitive to stress in our environment, meaning it affects us more. And that, of course, makes us more vulnerable to illness. So, not great. Natural, necessary, but these are times where we're slightly more vulnerable in terms of our health. I want to just talk a little bit more about the biology of menopause, because this is really important when it comes to understanding why might neurodivergent people be more vulnerable during menopause. I really like this analogy for menopause, where it's like your car is changing from a petrol car to a diesel car. So we know that if you put the wrong kind of fuel in your car, it doesn't like it. Similarly, with your brain has to come up with a whole new way of working, and hence that reorganization that we see in the brain during menopause. You can see that in this image from a recent study. So basically what's happening here is that during menopause, estrogen and progesterone are declining, and hence the brain is increasing its estrogen receptors. You can see that in the after menopause image. So basically, estrogen receptors are points in the brain that can kind of make use of estrogen. So the brain is making more of those receptors, basically to try and soak up as much effect as possible from that dwindling estrogen. It's also doing other things, the brain. It's pumping out what we call follicular stimulating hormone, basically trying to prod the ovaries, give me more estrogen. And of course, this doesn't work. So estrogen and progesterone are what we call sex hormones, but they actually do things throughout the body and the brain. In the brain, they're vital for brain health and repair, and they're also vital for maintaining an equilibrium in neurotransmitters, so chemicals that make things happen in the brain that are involved in mood and thought processes. So what we see is that as estrogen decreases during menopause, so does serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, and GABA. These are all neurotransmitters, and basically the result of this decrease is that a person experiences depression or low mood, anxiety. They might be more emotionally changeable, so they have more extreme emotions. And they also might experience a kind of flatness where they don't feel as much pleasure in life or as much sense of reward. So declining estrogen also affects cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And what we see during menopause is that cortisol climbs to a higher baseline level. and it's more prone to spiking as well when you encounter something stressful. So basically what that means is that you're generally more stressed during menopause, but you're also more reactive to stress. You kind of go from 0 to 60 miles an hour faster and easier, and it's harder for you to kind of come down from stress. This is all great. So basically, during menopause, there's something very significant going on where you are losing the neuroprotective effects of estrogen and progesterone. This really matters if you are someone who's vulnerable to, especially vulnerable to losing these neuroprotective effects. So if you're someone with a history of trauma and stress affect the brain, and that wear and tear of stress on the brain actually becomes more evident at menopause. So you lose those neuroprotective effects of estrogen and progesterone, which are involved in brain repair, and hence the effects of trauma are effectively unmasked. So we know that people with a history of stress and trauma will on average enter menopause slightly earlier because stress and trauma age your body. And we know that entering menopause slightly earlier isn't great health-wise because it means that you're having to live longer in a state of estrogen deprivation. We also know that people with a history of trauma and stress experience menopausal symptoms as more severe. So, of course, having a history of stress and trauma actually sensitizes the stress system, so it makes you more likely to be stressed in future. And then at menopause, that also sensitizes the stress system. So you've got a kind of double impact there. There's other groups who are vulnerable too. So if you're someone with a pre-existing mental illness or a condition affecting the nervous system, like chronic fatigue or multiple sclerosis, then losing those neuroprotective effects of estrogen might worsen these conditions that you're already living with. And similarly, if you're someone with a physical illness, then losing the neuroprotective and the general bodily protective effects of estrogen can be really significant for you. So say you've already got thin bones, osteoporosis might become a real difficulty. Estrogen even protects your skin from tearing, meaning that if you've got reduced mobility, if you're in a wheelchair, you are more vulnerable to pressure sores. It has such profound effects throughout the body. So if you are someone with physical or mental illnesses pre-existing before menopause, it's a time where people are vulnerable to sort of flare-ups or the development of new conditions. So based on this, what we know about neurodivergent people gives us cause to be concerned and think about supporting them, because we know that both ADHDers, people with ADHD, and autistic people in midlife, so when they're adults, in their 30s, 40s and beyond, they have higher than average rates of physical illnesses, mental illnesses, and of course, relatedly, suicidality. We recently saw this in a study conducted by my PhD student, Uni Kim, and she collected data from nearly 1,000 autistic and non-autistic people. And she found that autistic people were 2 to 3 times more likely during menopause to have respiratory illnesses, gastrointestinal illnesses, reproductive and neurological disorders, immune conditions, autoimmune conditions, inflammatory disorders, and they were even 4 times more likely to have musculoskeletal disorders and chronic and complex conditions, such as, for instance, what we know about the prevalence of connective tissue disorders like Ehlers-Danlos syndromes in autistic people and ADHDers. So what this means is that neurodivergent people are more likely to go into menopause carrying physical and mental illnesses that can be exacerbated by menopause or worsened. We also know that they are more likely to enter menopause with bodies aged by stress and trauma. We know that autistic people and ADHDers often face victimization, abuse, exploitation, adverse childhood experiences, and difficulties in their adult lives. So this means that they might be more likely to be in that group who are entering menopause with trauma and stress. We also know that autistic people and ADHDers seem to be very sensitive to hormonal fluctuations. We know that they are sensitive to monthly hormonal fluctuations with periods. So we know that autistic people and ADHDers seem to be at higher risk of premenstrual dysphoric disorder and of painful periods. They find that their emotions are heightened, that their sensory sensitivities might be heightened. They might have more cognitive difficulties. They might be at higher risk of self-injury and suicide during monthly periods. And what we see is that other lifespan reproductive transitions show a similar picture. So at pregnancy, during childbirth and nursing, people likewise report having heightened sensory sensitivities, more intense emotions, more meltdowns, more shutdowns. And really importantly, during these times, they have a lot of difficulty accessing reproductive health care. This is really important because it means that when you go through reproductive transitions that are traumatic, that you have traumatic healthcare experiences, you are much less likely to want to seek help during menopause. We also know that neurodivergent people become increasingly isolated as they age. This is really important when it comes to menopause because I mentioned it's a slightly taboo topic. So social transmission of knowledge is how people tend to learn about menopause. They learn about it from chatting to their friends, close people. If you're someone who doesn't have a friendship circle, then you might well miss out on knowing about menopause. And what we know is that knowledge about menopause is really important in helping people cope with it. So you might not have a friendship circle to learn about menopause. You might not have a supportive relationship with healthcare practitioners to learn about it. But also, it's really important to say that around this time of life, you might be losing your support network to a degree. So, as I mentioned, your parents might be aging, might be getting ill, might be needing you to support them. And many autistic people and ADHDers actually live at home with their parents. And again, it just adds another level of uncertainty and difficulty while you're going through this lifespan transition. It's also worth mentioning a few aspects of neurodivergence which might make menopause more difficult. So if you're an autistic person, you really thrive on routine and predictability. And menopause is inherently unpredictable. Even doctors cannot tell you when you will enter menopause, how long it will last, what symptoms you will have, how you should even be treated, what treatment you should have. So it's fundamentally very uncertain, and that's really tricky for people. And of course, ADHDers and autistic people already struggle with emotions that are big and intense and difficult to control. We already struggle with memory, executive function, planning. We already struggle with sensory processing, so like hypersensitivity. And menopause affects all of these things. Interesting fact, we even have estrogen receptors in our ears. So this just shows you how profoundly estrogen is involved in everything related to cognition, thought, emotion, sensory sensitivities. So it makes people with pre-existing differences quite vulnerable. And autistic people and ADHDers often experience something called alexithymia. So that's a difficulty identifying and communicating your emotions. They might also experience interoceptive difficulties. That's basically a difficulty identifying what's going on with my body. Am I in pain? Am I too cold? Do I feel sick? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? So if you've got all of that going on, it can make it very difficult to understand what's going on. I feel bad, but I don't know why. I can't tell a doctor that, this is what's happening to me, because I can't pin down what's happening. So these things could make menopause very difficult. We also need to recognise the fact that because autism and ADHD have been historically underdiagnosed in people assigned female at birth, people who have gone through menopause at this point in time will tend to be people who have been undiagnosed. Maybe they're diagnosed now, but a lot of them went through menopause undiagnosed. And growing up undiagnosed is very, very hard. People struggle with employment, with friendships, with school, with relationships. They're very vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and they're often very self-critical. Because they don't understand why they're different, they label themselves, or other people label them, a bit of a mess, stupid, a failure, broken. They blame themselves for everything they struggle with, for not fitting in, for even, being victimized. So being late or undiagnosed autistic, or indeed late or undiagnosed ADHD, is linked with poorer outcomes. Late and undiagnosed people tend to have poorer mental health, higher suicide rates, possibly higher levels of trauma. So they're going into menopause with all of that on their shoulders, very self-critical and with low self-worth. Hopefully things will be different for future generations who are hopefully more likely to go into menopause knowing that they're neurodivergent. But I'm going to talk about the evidence that we have now, and I'm going to focus more on autism because that's where we've done our work. But I'm going to highlight the overlaps with ADHD, and a lot of our participants were also ADHD. So what we see across studies with autistic people is that they very often go into menopause unprepared, which is something we also see in ADHDers. And this can be really scary for people. People often say to us, I thought I was going mad, but they also say, I was frightened I had a disease, that something was wrong with me. Maybe I had early onset dementia. And people, what they were experiencing didn't match up with descriptions of menopause that you can read anywhere online. So they knew about symptoms like hot flushes, but they hadn't been able to anticipate, what these would actually be like, how intense they would be, how impactful. They couldn't recognize a description written down with, this huge thing that is happening to me and all these different effects. What they were experiencing just didn't resemble a normal neurotypical menopause. And so that was really frightening and overwhelming. And there's been a number of studies actually comparing autistic and non-autistic people in terms of menopausal symptoms. And studies are beginning to show that they do objectively report more intense or severe or problematic menopause symptoms than non-autistic people. So the study you can see here was looking at different types of menopause symptoms. And very interestingly, the existing research that we know of suggests that for autistic people, it might be especially those psychological symptoms and somatic symptoms which are increased. So the psychological ones are like the emotion changes, the cognitive changes, somatic symptoms are your joint pain, your headaches, whereas they don't seem to stand out so much in the vasomotor symptoms. So vasomotor symptoms are your hot flushes and your night sweats. So there's not a lot of evidence here yet, so we can't draw a strong conclusion. But there is also some suggestion that the psychological symptoms likewise are most problematic for ADHDers. Those cognitive changes in your thought processes, in your emotions. But we know that autistic people also experience less common symptoms of menopause, such as flare-ups in chronic illnesses, which might be less likely in non-autistic people. Beyond actually looking at menopause symptoms themselves, though, there seems to be something really essential in the combination or the interaction between menopause and neurodivergence. So people in our research studies often talk about autistic menopause. They don't talk about being autistic and being menopausal or being menopausal as an autistic person. They talk about autistic menopause as a thing. This is something we've written a book about recently, which will be out later this year by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. And basically, our argument in this book, based on the research we've done, is that there seems to be a reciprocal relationship where menopause affects the way you experience your neurodivergence, and being neurodivergent affects the way you experience your menopause. And the combination of those two things, the interaction, seems to be what floors some people, in the words of our participants. So let me walk you through that interaction. So how does menopause interact with neurodivergent features? So pre-existing difficulties with cognition, so planning, executive function, memory, these things are already hard and they get worse. So one person described it as walking through life with a head full of cotton wool and a body that refuses to behave. Because these are things that are already difficult for neurodivergent people, it means that there can be really profound effects on their ability to be independent, to manage daily self-care, to work. So a lot of people lost jobs or fell into financial arrears. Some became very dependent on partners and elderly parents, which is really damaging for their self-worth. And a lot of people talked about experiencing burnout in this time. I really want to emphasize this interaction with a common feature of neurodivergence is how it impacts people who already have lifelong challenges with self-worth. So neurodivergence bestows some really fantastic skills, especially in the workplace. So say, for instance, one of our participants talked about the wonderful gift of hyperfocus that they got from being someone, an ADHD, autistic with ADHD. So neurodivergent people typically have very low self-worth. And they often pin their worth to things like productivity, job performance, identity that you get from a job. And what people find at menopause is that these gifts of neurodivergence, these enabling aspects, can actually flip to disabling. And that is devastating for people who talk about being robbed of their skills, of having always been able to rely on their intelligence, even though they've struggled with everything else. And now suddenly that thing which gave them self-worth feels like it's gone. And that's really hard for people. And again, there are pre-existing difficulties with emotion. Emotions are already difficult, overwhelming, uncontrollable. And this is amplified at menopause. And this actually led some people to say menopause is actually life-threatening for me in terms of its impact on my mental health, on self-harm, on suicide attempts. And so people found that during menopause, some of those coping strategies that they'd had no longer cut the mustard. They no longer worked. So they found it a lot harder to cope in the world, and their mental health really took a knock. People talked about pre-existing difficulties with social relationships, the weight of masking. So people found it harder to mask, harder to keep eye contact, harder to understand non-literal language, banter, this kind of thing. And people also talked about the impact of menopausal symptoms like hot flushes that might make you very anxious or very embarrassed So if you're already masking and all the time you're worrying about you might have a hot flush, it kind of impacts people's confidence, makes it even harder to communicate. So a lot of people during menopause said it was just so much exhausting, hard work to be around other people that I couldn't do it. And I ended up really isolated because
So my guest can go to the toilet.
I just didn't have the energy to actually communicate. Just noting someone's got their sound on, so I want to turn that. And during this time, people did become more isolated and they struggled to access help, including from doctors. People had pre-existing sensory sensitivities, and these likewise might be heightened, or they might even develop new sensory sensitivities during this time. One person described this as a dominating, incredible, awful, debilitating thing. And other people said about how difficulties with interoception kind of were heightened during menopause. So people who didn't really have much sense of what was going on with their body, they existed as a head prior to menopause. Suddenly all this stuff was going on. And it was really taking up their capacity, their mental, it was taking up quite a bit of their mental energy and their emotional energy just to tolerate all this stuff that's going on with my body and my senses. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of stuff happens around menopause. And one of our participants used the phrase a Venn diagram of chaos, with menopause happening at just the same time as all these other things. So they're already handling a house, having children, they're supporting their children or fighting for their neurodivergent children. They might have a job, they might have a husband, they're balancing all of that. They are perhaps supporting parents. One person talked about losing their mum during this time and experiencing grief, as you can see in the bottom right, but having alexithymia that made it really hard to understand what was going on while they were grieving the loss of their parent. Other people are kind of becoming aware that even if they haven't lost their parent or their partner or the like, they are becoming more aware of the future and the threat to their support network. We also have people talk about, they reflect on menopause, kind of making them think a lot about all the things they haven't done. So they hadn't had the career, they hadn't had the family or the marriage, and so they felt really separate from other people going through menopause with all these things that they hadn't done. And we also had people who were stepping out of the workplace. They could no longer manage working, and hence they were losing that identity, which might have been the only identity where they'd liked themselves. And people found during this time that they just really struggled to get help. Often GPs, doctors wouldn't recognise that they were really struggling because perhaps they didn't show distress in the expected way. And maybe if you can't figure out what's going on with your body, you can't communicate that you need help. And some people were saying, I don't have a social network, so I don't have anyone to talk to about this. And we had some people who were non-binary and transgender, really important intersections, who likewise said they felt very shut out of the literature and the discourse around menopause because it wasn't relevant to their experience. So several studies have shown that for some autistic people, they really struggle during menopause to the extent that their functioning, their well-being, their mental health deteriorates so much that they are actually diagnosed as autistic during this time. And they talk about menopause being a lot harder because of the fact of going through it undiagnosed. People just couldn't explain why they couldn't just get on with it like other people. They were a lot more self-critical. And so it seems to be really important to go through diagnosed. And we see something very similar with ADHD, again, where people who've always struggled in life are struggling so much more during menopause. And this one person described it as a brutal and life-changing experience, which has the silver lining of bringing ADHD and autism to the surface so that someone can be diagnosed. But it's such a difficult time where people's difficulties become so obvious, and sometimes they lose things like the ability to work, like their health and their well-being, their independence. And they are recognised as neurodivergent in the face of these huge losses. It's really important to note that there are other populations who are likely to have similar difficulties. So our studies haven't involved people with learning disabilities, but we know that non-autistic people with learning disabilities can really struggle in terms of understanding what's happening and knowing and being supported. So there's so many unanswered questions from this research, and I think one of the most important is around why do some people struggle more than others? Our studies always call to people who've struggled. So if you've had a really easy time, you tend to not want to participate. So it's really important to emphasize, we know that some autistic people and some ADHDers have a really easy time during menopause, whereas some neurotypical people have a really hard time. So why is this? I've highlighted some characteristics and experiences which might make a difference. So autistic people and ADHDers, we all differ in how sensory, do we have sensory sensitivities? Do we have alexithymia? How much do we struggle with executive function, emotions, interoceptive difficulties? We all vary in this. So these might be reasons why some people struggle more than others. But we've also been looking at the way people feel and think about menopause, how much sense of control they have over what's going on, and how coherently they think about it. So do they have a clear understanding of what's going on? And we've found that autistic people tend to feel less in control, and they have a less coherent understanding of what's going on, probably because there's so much more going on for them, all these chronic illnesses, all the sensory sensitivities. But it means that they feel less in control and they feel less clear about what's happening to them. And this seems to predict having more severe menopause symptoms. And of course, the really essential question is, how do we best support people? I'm going to focus here on a work context with a few thoughts. But we also need to know about how best to support people with hormone replacement therapy, with psychological therapies. We just don't know how best to support people. Anecdotally, we find that a lot of neurodivergent people find hormone replacement therapy life-saving. But anecdotally, doctors tell us that it takes more trial and error in order to find the right regime. But we just don't know. We don't have the scientific literature there yet to know how best to support people. So let me give you a few workplace thoughts. This was a phrase used by one of our participants, and I think what I really want to get across here is that neurodivergent and neurotypical staff might have some similar challenges at menopause, but for neurodivergent people, their symptoms and their difficulties might be much more extreme, with added effects of neurodivergence. What this means for you in terms of your workplace is, if you think about existing ways that your organisation is menopause friendly, you need to be ready to extend or adapt those on the basis of discussion with your neurodivergent staff. So this intersection of neurodivergence and menopause, it's new ground for all of us. So while we wait for insights from research, the really crucial thing is to listen to what neurodivergent people need at menopause. Also help them. They may not know this, they may need some time to work that out, but listen to them and respect that you might need to make exceptions from typical menopause policies, because these are not neurotypical circumstances. Remember key areas of difficulty for neurodivergent people around emotions, sensory sensitivities, executive functions, timekeeping and organisation, socialising with peers and line managers. These are all things where people might have been able to keep their difficulties under wraps at work in the past, but these kinds of things can be worsened at menopause, and this can cause people to burn out. So what this means is that previously people might have been able to get by without reasonable adjustments for autism and ADHD. But the way they experience their neurodivergence has changed at menopause. So some people might not actually need adjustments that are designed for menopause and autism or menopause and ADHD. They might just need general autism and ADHD adaptations that they haven't previously needed. However, you do need to do this kind of flexible trial and error, perhaps take a little bit from the autism sector, take a bit from the ADHD, take a bit from the menopause, and see what fits people. Really, really importantly, though, remember that this is new to them. They've never gone through menopause before, and many of them might be quite new to their neurodivergence. So going through a late diagnosis is a very emotional process, so they might be coming to terms with that, and they might not understand what support and reasonable adjustments they need. So it's really important to be compassionate during this time. Menopause is difficult. Being neurodivergent and menopausal is even harder. So be very aware of how difficult this can be and be as supportive as possible. So really importantly, because people are at such high risk of burnout and leaving the workforce at this time, don't wait for a diagnosis. I'm sure all of you know that it can take years to get a diagnosis through the NHS, and in some cases it's not possible as an adult. So if your employees think they might be neurodivergent, believe them, because we know for a fact that many, many neurodivergent adults were missed as children. So work with them now to maintain their participation in the workforce. Really importantly, try not to be pigeonholed by diagnoses, because autism and ADHD often co-occur. So really try to be flexible, to kind of treat this as a case-by-case trial and error process rather than a one-time thing. So they might, it might be a case of, trying typical adjustments for autism, menopause, ADHD, seeing how they work, seeing how they can be fine-tuned. And I'm very happy to talk more about other kinds of support. But what I would like to do is I will stop here. So we've got some time for some questions. But thank you all so very much for listening. And you can read the resources, look at the resources and read the research at my site. And do look out for our book later this year. Thank you so much.